Hello and welcome to Nagoya KEI music review. This is going to be an introduction video to the Japanese band Laputa. And I own several of their albums. These are the albums from my personal collection. So Laputa was a band that formed, I'd say, in the 90s or so. That's actually when they formed, in the 90s. And they started off in the early 90s as a band called I Sick Face, which consisted of Aki on vocals, Tomoe on drums, which those two were the band leaders. And then you'd have Hideno on guitar and Kusaba on bass. So they released a demo tape. It's out there on YouTube. You can go, feel free to check it out. It's a pretty interesting, first demo from what they had originally released. So they had that formation. They released a demo tape, and then soon enough, Hideno decided to quit the band. So Hideno left, and then thus there was a new reformation as to what is now Laputa. And earlier on in this time, they released more demo tapes, this time as Laputa, with Aki on vocal, Tomoe on drums, Kusaba on I think either probably Kusaba might have left or something at some point, but I know a couple of the original members left. I think Kusaba was still on bass at this point, and then we had the introduction of Junji on guitar, and wasn't later until Koichi from Silver Rose, before they released their first full-length EP, before they got signed to Toshiba EMI. And he joined the band. But in that iteration, I believe Genji was on guitar, and then somehow later on they added Koichi, and then released a few demos, and then, Kusaba left. So at this point, Laputa was forced to undergo a drastic change in their lineup, so they had to decide what to do. And so Junji decided he would take up bass guitar, and so that was that. So with Koichi added on electric guitar, Junji on bass, and Tomoe on drums, and Aki on vocal. So thus we have the final formation. So what I'm holding here in my hands, this is actually the second album, major label album, that I own. Their first major label debut, after they released at least 2 mini albums independently. They got picked up by Toshiba EMI. So the first album that they released was called Kagero, which I don't have. And that is a phenomenal breakout album. They had a strong breakout, but I believe this band was often misunderstood for what they were. They weren't treated as fairly or as well as most other Visual Kei bands were at the time. They often got compared to their predecessor, which was Kuroyume, who happened to be on the same label. So these bands, Laputa and Kuroyume, came from Nagoya, Japan. In fact, you probably could go back into the Visual Kei lore, and, if you want to go even further back, Aki and Tomoe were both roadies for Kuroyume at one point in time. So this is like I said, this is their second album, called Imadara. And this one doesn't have the fancy packaging. This was, I got this for pretty cheap off of eBay. This is like a rental CD, so in Japan they would put stickers on these little rental discs here. I still kept the Obi strip. Everything's intact. Sorry if I bumped the camera on there. So they are on the subsidiary label called East World. And this is the main booklet that you would see. It's kind of falling apart, so I'm barely even opening it. That's Koichi there on guitar. All the songs on this album, pretty much phenomenal. Really strong, dark influence. Very gothic influence, actually. I've read some of their lyric translations. They're kind of interesting because they kind of remind me of, reminds you of a lot of the emo music that got popularized, especially when the lyrics are kind of cheesy. But I really dig this band mainly for their the electric guitar work of Koichi. His solos are fantastic on this album. So this was for the second album, this is a pretty decent album. Eve was a standout track that was released originally as a single. And, charted fairly well, probably in Japan. And was kind of their breakout single, other than their previous first single, Garasu no Shozo. So that is Imadara. Now, second album that I own, this was released in 1998, and they switched from, they're still on Toshiba EMI at this point, but they switched from Toshiba EMI to a subsidiary label called Express. Now, Express was a label back in the 70s and 80s that released a lot of kind of more J-pop, city pop type stuff, some rock stuff here and there, but mostly it was pop music. Anywho, they switched to this label, still same distributor, still Toshiba EMI, just a different distributor label. Now at this point, this is when I got the actual copy. I bought this brand new. A matter of fact, it was still sort of quasi in print when I got it at the time. So this is Jacko, which translates to musk. I'm not sure what the previous album translated as, which I should have gotten into that. But as you can see, they came with these really nice gate folded kind of sleeve things. Looked like a comic. Had photos in the photo book. Here you have Aki. They're playing with toilet paper for some reason. All these photos, they went to London to shoot all these photographs. Whoever did the photography did a phenomenal job on this. Really captured some moments. There's Aki there. There's Junji being Junji. Nice, lovely photo of Koichi there, Tomoe there. Sitting at a craps table. There's a Koichi with his big feathery hat. And Tomoe looking off in the distance at some sort of television set in a nice hotel room. And Junji kind of looks like he's bathing himself. Another crazy looking picture of Junji. And then Tomoe sitting around some street corner. And then there's the cover photograph. I like the interesting choice of the makeup. So like sitting by a fire and eating what appears to be a piece of steak and having a glass of wine, very typical English breakfast. They must have hired some model for this. I really liked the fact that they had these different models on their covers. which I don't know why they chose. It's kind of a goofy cover, but I don't know why they chose this cover of the model attempting to eat a steak. It's kind of goofy in my opinion. Then there's the disc itself. So yeah, this is a Toshiba EMI label, which now EMI was EMI's that British label that got bought out by Universal at some point in time. So now Universal Music pretty much owns the majority of the rights to their songs. There's the, this is the inner sleeve, kind of what I showed previously, but there's more photos. They chose different photos for those. On this album, this is actually my favorite album. Imadara is still good. There's a lot of great standout tracks on there, like Monochrome. Reincarnation Morning is a good track. I like that track a lot. Eve's a different one, pretty decent one. On Jacko, they kind of still stay the same with the kind of that gothic type of vibe and feel. They kind of drifted away from the sound of their elders. Kuroyume. There's more photos like that. It's just really fantastically well-produced album. Was self-produced by Laputa. And then another producer, Toshihiro Nara. So for tracks 4 and 7, so they had an additional producer by the name of Nobuhiko Sato. So, yep. And then the programmer, interestingly enough, and this will have a connection tie, because Junichi Igarashi went on to play keyboards for GACT and became a part of GACT Job. So there's some sort of correlation and connection there. So, with that being said, this is one of my favorite albums by them. I don't even play CDs hardly anymore. I used to play them all the time. But I have all these also, plus their other albums, which I don't own on my phone, which I've downloaded those albums. So, just some stellar, tracks here. Every single track on here is pretty much a hit. The one that's kind of, hit and miss, swing, sway away for me. Rose is a standout track. Chemical Reaction's pretty decent. All these tracks are really, really good. Now we get to a point where there's a break in their activity. And by 1999, they had released an album, which I don't have, called Kakera. And that was a huge album for them. Really awesome album. I wish I owned it. I don't own it. Maybe, hopefully, I'll find it someday for cheap on eBay and get it. But if I wanted to be a completist in their collection, which is very impossible to do because Japanese discs are still very expensive. So at this point in time, they released that album, 99, had a huge tour, pretty decent, successful tour, and, still had a, mass amount of fans. So they decided, well, we need to take a break. And they took a break for a year in 2000. So by 2001, they decided to switch labels. So their contract was either their contract was up, or maybe EMI wanted them to do more albums, continue on releasing more material. They decided to take a break, jumped labels from Toshiba EMI to Nippon Crown. So this single was released in 2001 and was released under Nippon Crown. It's called Shape. And then the B-side has two B-sides. It has Ticker and Final. Ticker is one of my favorite tracks. I think Shape is a standout track overall. Not really going to attempt to open this here because it's kind of funky, or maybe I actually will. So I'm really kind of trying to be careful with everything here. So that's the little thing, I guess maybe for their live, little advertisement for their live. And then I still have the OB strip. There's the lyric sheet for Shape, Ticker, and Final. And then they even switched producers, so Masayuki Nakahara produced this single. Really standout single. B-sides are good. I really kind of wish that Laputa released a B-sides collection, because that would have been awesome to own, but they didn't. They decided not to. Their label Toshiba EMI in 2000 decided to release a compilation album, kind of like a greatest hits best of. It was like a 3-disc deal of all their hits. So now we come into the album Heaven. And Heaven, of course, still released under Nippon Crown. So they continued on the Nippon Crown until about the end of their tenure. So this album here is Heaven, like I said before. I've probably shown this one. I'm going to show this one here. So this is their photo booklet there. So they still continued on with their lavish photo booklets, but this time I don't think they went anywhere else. It's still photographed there in Japan or whatever. So there's the title. And I like the fact that every album had this. They went all out for their fans. You know, they wanted to make sure their fans got the very best. You know, and that makes a lot of sense with every Japanese band. Still came in that little gate-folded sleeve. And I imagine this is pretty expensive to make for an album. I mean, to release. It's like, okay, yeah, we want to do photo booklet. We're going to go all out. Do the photo booklet. Then do the inner sleeve there with the lyrics, and still continue on with more photos. And also, during this time, you know, the majority of the songwriting, let's get to that for a second. So the majority of the songwriting was pretty much done by Aki, the vocalist, and Koichi, their guitarist. So they always had songs that they wrote. And they would, you know, switch back and forth. And then occasionally their bassist, Junji, would write some material. You know, his material is more experimental. And by this point in time, they started to change up their sound and became a little bit more electronic here and there. They added some electronic sounds, but still kind of maintained their earlier sound for a little bit. So this album is absolutely still one of my favorites. Blast Off Time is kind of their introductory track. Programized Heaven's alright. Silent Onlooker, which is one of their singles. It's one of my favorite singles of them. Devil's Waiting is good. Sapless Heart's one of my favorites. Dazzling Sun, Shape, I Cry Dance, that's another good song. Borderline, Blind Man's Buff, and then Black Sheep. So, solid album for it being self-produced. Now we get to a point in time where they started to, let's say, they started to do more EPs because I guess they were kind of getting musically frustrated with each other. I guess that's how you would put it. And so 2002 wasn't the best year for them. And there's another album that they released called, let's see, what are they called? New Temptation. And during that time, there's a lot of things going on. Koichi Self wasn't doing too well, so he ended up being hospitalized, got out of the hospital, in and out of the hospital from the time that he was recording that album. And, I like that album. It's pretty decent for what it is, but it's not their strong suit. So they still even heavily continue to experiment with more keyboards and electronic beats and whatnot. And then this is a mini album, or an EP as I would like to call it. And of course contains 6 tracks. This is one of the first, this is actually the second mini album that I purchased from them, because believe it or not, a lot of their albums were really, really hard to find. And really expensive to get a hold of. And I didn't really have the money at the time. So before I get into this one here, this one is the first one that I bought, called Material Pleasures. So we'll get to that one in a moment. So New Temptation they released, and then they started to release these set of mini albums at the very end of their career. And they've since expanded in 2004. They've gone on to various solo projects and whatnot. But now going back to what I was saying. So they released a set of mini albums. Glitter. This one being Sparks Monkey. And Material Pleasures. So it was a trio of mini albums. I really wish, honestly, they could have just released one solid album instead of 3 separate mini albums. It's kind of a pain in the neck for me. Kind of a pain in the neck as a collector, but it is what it is. So 2003, they released this album. They're still under Nippon Crown. And they did away with the fancy booklets and so on and so forth. I guess at this point they just couldn't stand each other, so they're just like, screw this, let's just make a mini album. And so I'm going to go ahead and open it up here. This is a jacket from the mini album Sparks Monkey. So you have, Two Lovers, Real World, Body Communication, Treat Your Fuck, which is a Junji track, Freedom, and Sparks Monkey, the title track of the EP. So this is more, even continuously, more experimental, even deeper, diving deeper into electronic sounds. So Aki was starting to embrace more electronic sounds. So is Junji. So they were kind of diving deep into that lore, so to speak. So this is that cover there. There's Two Lovers. I don't know if I'm really in the viewpoint of the camera or not. Now I am. Two Lovers, Real World, Body Communication, and then that's them there. Treat Your Fuck, which is kind of a goofy track. Freedom. Okay, so my opinions on these tracks are as follows, and I'm going to go into a deeper, in-depth review of these albums and tell you my top standout tracks. So, majority of the tracks on this disc were written by Junji, the bassist. Koichi contributed to 2 tracks on this album, on this mini album or EP, if you will. Two Lovers and Real World. So that's the Two Lovers in Real World. So my favorite tracks on this album, I like the first 3 tracks, and then I like Freedom. That's a good one as well. But Treat Your Fuck, not so much. Sparks, Fuck Monkey, it's alright. It's an alright album. So they kind of started to peter off at this point. And they still decided, what the heck, at this point, 2004, we reach, and then they release this EP, and then they disband. And then Such Is No More. So you have Material Pleasures, which is, their most electronic mini album ever. There's lots of beats and such. They look lovely on there. So you have Persona, Material Pleasures, Beauty and Butterfly, Stray, Gorgeous, and Off. So Off was written by Junji. As you can tell, it's the closing track. Let's see who else wrote all these songs. Aki and Koichi wrote Persona. Material Pleasures, Aki and Koichi. Beauty and Butterfly, Aki and Koichi. Stray, Aki and Junji. Gorgeous, Aki and Junji. Off by Junji. Lyrics and music by Junji. So, 2004, they released this disc. It was released in March of 2004. And by this point in time, they just couldn't stand each other. They needed a break. I think they even deserved a longer break than most bands. They really just needed it for themselves creatively. And I guess it was that time where they just had to call it quits. Every track is good pretty much on this EP, except with the exception of, Off. I could deal without Off. Not a fan of Laputa's solo works. I'll talk a little bit briefly about that in another video. But one gripe and complaint that I have with this EP is that it's poorly mixed. And they decided to just, by that point in time, they decided to do the most minimal packaging. They didn't even decide to, you can't even tell who mixed it, who produced it, or whatnot. They just decided, oh, screw it. We're not going to even mention about who produced what. I think with this last one, it was still self-produced. So they just decided kind of call it quits, and then that's the end of Laputa. So by far, let me get it back in order here. I'd say you have this transition of them, going from, in the beginning, kind of starting off really strong. And this is something that I see with most Visual Kei bands in general, is that the ones that peter off super fast, what happens is they end up releasing these really strong records in the beginning. and then all of a sudden something happens. They hit this musical burnout, and they don't know what to do with themselves, so the only thing to do is disband. So they ended up disbanding. So tragically that this happened. So in the end, what happened was, by this time everyone went solo. 2004 hit their last live at Lemon CC Music Hall, and it's kind of rushed, kind of a rushed last live, if you will. I watched a little bit of it. It's available up on YouTube, I think, still. Somebody graciously uploaded it because I wanted to buy the DVD and I couldn't afford it at the time because it was super expensive. But anywho, they also had released a couple concerts. They released All Burst, which was their last live, and then in 2001 they had released Heaven to Perfection when they were on their Heaven tour. So they performed at this outdoor hall, and that's pretty neat. I actually like the outdoor live a lot. And after that, Peter off in solo activities. Junji went off to form Halation C4. He was in a band called C4 currently now, and has Halation. He records albums and releases singles and does lives every now and then. Aki has gone on to release, several multiple singles and has had a prolific solo career. He still continues to perform lives, does live streams, and I follow his Instagram. I've been frequenting his Instagram quite a bit, so he's always posting photos from those lives and whatnot. And the drummer Tomoe has gone off into playing drums for a band called KEI, and as well as playing for the group C4. So him and Junji are still around, kind of making music together, but off in a totally different band. Now's where we hit a brick wall, because Koichi ends up becoming this kind of enigma. And what happens with him is he, has a solo career, starts it up, releases several a handful of singles here and there, a mini album in the last few years. And then 2008 and 2009, he ends up joining, starting up a group called C4, not C4, blah, blah. Ends up forming up a group called Crossover with the former vocalist of Moi Di Moi, Juka. And that lasts for about an album or so and a handful of singles. And then he does maybe one or two singles as Everlasting King. And then 2011, after 2011, he's pretty much done. He's out of the music scene entirely. If you go to his YouTube page, he doesn't have a YouTube page. If you go to his Twitter's completely dead. His website still exists, but it has not been updated since 2011. So I'm wondering what the heck is up with him, if he's still making music or not. And I really respect him as a guitarist because he's one of my favorites. And I just love his use of tones. That's partially what attracted me to this band. I feel like Laputa is the band for, if you're a guitarist primarily, you want to listen to this band. If you're a bassist, listen to Kuroyume because that's where the main meat and potatoes are is in Kuroyume. So this is more of a guitar centric band. Kuroyume is more of a bass centric band. So that is Laputa in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed this. Cheers. Till next time.